All right, everybody, here's Chapter 1. Our introduction. What do medical sociologists study? It can be broken down into these four groups. These four things are what we're going to be really looking at throughout the course of this semester. We start with the social causes and patterns of health and disease. We move into social behavior of healthcare personnel and their patients. Then we get to the social functions of health organizations and institutions, such as hospitals. And then we end with the relationship of healthcare delivery systems to other social systems. Sounds easy enough, right? Of course, it takes us about 15 weeks to get there, but it's a good thing we have those 15 weeks. So we'll start with the term, the social determinants of health. Now, the term refers to several things, but here's three groupings that more or less encapsulate what we're going to be talking about. The social practices and conditions, such as lifestyles, living, and work situations. We move to class position. Class position among sociologists, we're referring to things like income, education, and occupation. We use these variables to determine where somebody resides in the, social hierarchy. Finally, we'll get to stressful circumstances such as poverty, economic issues such as unemployment, business recessions, and so on. Taken together, these three groups of factors result in different health outcomes for different groups among the population. Now, we're also going to be looking at other things, especially towards the end of the course, such as political issues, such as policies, government benefits, and finally, religious factors that affect the health of individuals, groups, and communities, and it can work either positively or negatively. The religious factors are always kind of a wild card. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. It all depends on the tenets of the particular religion, I suppose. So, the history of medical sociology. Most of the early works were written by physicians, focused on the connections between social conditions and health. Now, early sociologists didn't really give much attention to matters of health and medicine. Frankly, they felt it was beneath them. And if you look at the state of health and medicine in the late 19th century, when a lot of this early sociology was being written, there wasn't really much to write about. At this point, we're still talking leeches and bad humors and what have you. It wasn't until really federal funding after World War II. Medicine became more modernized, became more scientific in a lot of ways. And this the funding sources that were available resulted in early collaborations among sociologists and psychiatrists. And from there, collaborations between sociologists and medical professionals, grew. The funding, of course, forced an early emphasis on applied research. So a lot of the early medical sociology is very applied. There's not a whole lot of theory going on there. Now, this changed a bit with Talcott Parsons. He wrote this book, The Social System, in 1951. It's this big, huge tome that they make you read if you go to graduate school. And among other things, he talked about issues such as health, illness, and the role of medicine in society. Now, he pioneered, really, the structural functionalist perspective, which we'll get into more as the semester goes along. But the gist is that a society is a kind of like a machine, right? It has interconnected parts. All of the parts need to be working in working order for the machine to function. And so for Parsons, he viewed health and illness as a possible disruption in the machine, right? Whenever people are sick, they need to, in a lot of ways, withdraw from their social roles. You don't go to work, you don't go to school, and so on. And so Parsons was interested, really, in how we as a society mitigate this issue. So he talks about the role of medicine. He also talks about something called the sick role, which is how we're expected to act and how we do act when we're sick. When we're sick, we know that we can, not go to work, maybe get an extension on a paper, all these different things. All the rules kind of get fuzzier. And for Parsons, the reason for this was to allow a little bit of slack in the system so that people can, of course, get sick and then, of course, have time to get themselves better and then rejoin their social roles, and the society just keeps marching along. So the sick role that he talks about here, here's a textbook definition of it. It's a patterned set of expectations defining the norms and values appropriate to being sick. Now, when you read it, it's one of those, well, yeah, of course, right? It doesn't seem like it's terribly profound. It seems pretty obvious. And in a lot of ways, sociology has been defined as the painful elaboration of the obvious. And that was actually Max Weber who said that. And the genius of it is that it's something we all knew was there, but Parsons was able to actually clearly define it and clearly explain the role of these patterns of expectations and the role these expectations serve to keep society functioning. All right, so we'll move on to Robert Strauss, talking about the division between the sociology in medicine and the sociology of medicine. And really what they're getting at here is the tension between applied research and more theoretical research. Now, this division is mostly found in the U.S. Because of our particular history. Remember, a couple slides ago, we talked about the initial funding sources being for applied research. So because of that, the applied research grew first. Now, the orientation of most research, whether in medicine or in sociology, towards practical application is still present to this day due to funding pressures. Again, if people are going to pay for a study, they want results, right? Now, theories are lovely, but at the end of the day, things need to happen. And because of this initial tension between applied and theory has been somewhat resolved. Even the theoretical folks need to have some kind of applied bent to their research in order to get money. So, the end result is it forces everybody to work together. Finally, we have the convergence with the main discipline of sociology. And the reason for this is regardless of the area, whether somebody does medical sociology, criminology, they study domestic violence or environmental issues, whatever it is, we all receive the same training, at least for the first part of our graduate studies. We all take the same methods classes, we take all the same theory classes, and as a result, there's a lot of crossover. We all know what each other are talking about, and so even the more applied folks will borrow some of these theoretical concepts to help explain the results they get in these applied studies they have, and vice versa. Alright, before we go much further, we should probably define health. The WHO definition is kind of the one people are going with now. It's the gold standard. And the definition, as is stated in your text, is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or injury. Now, this contrasts with how laypersons tend to view health. Laypersons, just your average person on the street, who tend to view health more as the ability to function. It has less to do with disease or injury. It has more to do with what can you still do. Can you still go to work? Can you still meet family obligations? Can you still go to school? What is it? Are there any limitations in their functional ability? So some research, especially older research, actually uses this ability to function as the overall measure of health. Now, more modern research views functional health as kind of a separate thing, or a subset of the WHO definition. Alright, so there's contrasting ideas about health and social behavior, which is to be expected, right? It's a long tradition with lots of people writing about it, lots of people studying it, and people have come to different conclusions. Now, a lot of this is, again, due to the history of all of this. So, we start with primitive humans. Hey, if we're going to talk history, let's talk about the primitive ones. They tended to rely on magic as the fundamental explanation of disease and illness. If you were sick, it's because you had ghosts in your blood or whatever, or you were cursed by a god. Now it moved on to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, who really is the first person, his writings are the first representation, really, of the first attempt to base an understanding of the body on rational thought. You were sick because of some kind of external factor. They didn't really have the germ theory of disease yet, that's much later, but at least they had the notion that there was some kind of biological machine that is the human being, and then when it breaks down, people get ill. Not because of witches or warlocks or ghosts or what have you. Hippocrates also recognized the contribution of the environment to human well-being, which really is the fundamental basis of the sociology of medicine, sociology of health. The argument, the underpinning of it is that health is a function of our interactions with the world. And now they may be picking up a disease, it may be smoking and drinking to the point where you're very ill and disabled, whatever it may be. There are these social factors. So there's this environment. When we say the environment, we're not necessarily talking about wetlands and beaches and stuff. We mean the social environment and how it affects human well-being. All right, well, after Hippocrates, we get to the Middle Ages. And here we see a split in the responsibility for human well-being. The church attends to the social needs, food, clothing, shelter, that kind of thing, while physicians focus on physical ailments, cholera, typhoid, whatever. And so we had the split here, which resulted in the way modern medicine that we knew in the late 18th century, focusing on physical ailments. So we have this split. So the social part of all of it was split up in the Middle Ages. The social well-being was considered a province of the church. The physical was for physicians. And the modern medicine reflects this. Modern, meaning late 18th century. Michael Foucault, that's how you say the guy's name, in 1973 wrote a book where he describes the development of modern medicine and notes this split between two trends. The two trends being the medicine of the species, which gave strong emphasis on classifying diseases, diagnosing and treating patients, and finding cures. The other fork of that split is the medicine of social spaces, which was concerned with preventing disease, especially through government involvement in matters of public hygiene. Now, modern medicine, again, we're talking about Foucault's modern medicine, rejects supernatural explanations for disease and treats it as an object to be studied, confronted scientifically, and controlled. And this, of course, carries on to this day. Then we get to the public's health, where the other side of that coin starts being addressed, where we start to see the systematic implementation of public health measures and improvements in public sanitation. Now, this period sees declining mortality rates from infectious diseases as a result. Essentially, it's amazing how much healthier the population is when we stop going to the bathroom in the water we're drinking. I know, again, painful elaboration of the obvious, but it wasn't all that clear to people before the 19th century. Take that for what it's worth. Now, these improvements in the population's health, mainly due to improvements in diet, housing, public sanitation, and personal hygiene, these improvements were really a result of these things, not so much medical innovations. Medical innovations started affecting health positively somewhat later. We're talking the 20th century. In the 19th century, though, this is what it was about. This was about, again, just getting clean drinking water, people eating correctly, housing that didn't leak, what didn't have so much mold. You get the idea. The idea of bathing every day was probably a good idea as well, at least every other day. All right, so we get to the germ theory of disease. We're moving on through, right? We had the scientific focus without a whole lot of science. Science was still in its early time. Medical science still in its early stages. Then we get the study of the health of public spaces. Now we're getting to the germ theory of disease. Here's where the scientific study of disease starts getting a little bit more sophisticated. And with that, we get the biomedical approach, where every disease has a specific pathogenic cause, best treated by removing or controlling that cause. Again, now we're starting to understand that when somebody gets a flu, it's because of a germ, not because of they got their hair wet and then went in the air conditioning. Well, they didn't have air conditioning. They got their hair wet and went out in the cold. These more superstitious things start washing away, and we start getting more sophisticated views. Now, medical practice at this point gives little attention to social causes of health. We still have that same split that Foucault was talking about, and instead focus on treating disease and illness with drugs, right? They wouldn't necessarily recommend cleaning up your drinking water. They just give you the medicine to treat your typhus, right? And then we get to the whole person healthcare, where we get to late 20th century or late 20th and the early 21st century. And from here, what we're talking about is the transition from infectious to chronic diseases as the leading causes of death. This is an epidemiological transition, of which there's a few. And this happened around the mid-20th century, all right, so 1950s or so. At this point, we have vaccines, we have better antibiotics, we have all manner of treatments for a lot of these infectious diseases that even 50 years prior killed people off in large numbers. So because of this, nobody's dying in their 20s of infectious diseases, so we're living longer. And When people live longer, the leading causes of death are no longer these infectious things, but actually chronic diseases such as heart disease, cardiovascular disease in general, cancers, things like this. And so the recognition that the social environment and the lifestyle practices influence chronic diseases encourages emphasis in medicine and on treating the whole person. See, simply focusing on pathogens at this point has already been done, really. We've already moved past it. We've had this epidemiological transition. So in order to treat the population now, we're less worried about dying of cholera, more worried about complications from diabetes. Now, we've already mentioned epidemiological transitions before, but we actually have them listed out for you here. There's 3 of them. The first one occurred about 10,000 years ago. Sorry, photos are not available. Human societies shifted from foraging, hunting and gathering, to agriculture. And from here, we see this emergence of new infectious and nutritional diseases. The diets became much more, or became much less varied, I should say. We also have animals living in close proximity to humans, so diseases in animals would eventually mutate and jump over to human beings. And so you start seeing things like smallpox and all these other things that affected animals, but now human beings are getting them. Flu viruses are like this too. Every so many years there's some kind of flu that comes out. The bird flu or the swine flu or monkeypox or whatever. You'll see it in the news media. The concern is that it'll jump over to human beings, which it does sometimes. Well, 10,000 years ago, this is when it first started happening. So, 200 years ago, we started to see improved nutrition and living standards. We talked about this already. We started seeing public health measures, medical advances, all of these things happening in developed societies that led to a decline in infectious diseases and a rise in chronic and degenerative diseases. That's what we just talked about. Now we get to the third, where we have the resurgence of infectious diseases previously thought to be under control. So that's where we are now. Now the potential for the spread of infectious diseases has been significantly enhanced in today's world by the globalization of trade and travel. That's the downside of the interconnected world, right? A disease that pops up, say, in sub-Saharan Africa doesn't take it very long to make it to, New York City. We get to West Nile virus, first appeared there in the summer of '99, which really confused the heck out of medical personnel and public health officials because they're like, this doesn't happen in the Western Hemisphere. But because there's the travel that there is, somebody hopped on a plane with it, and voila. Other theories had to do with mosquitoes hitching rides on boats. All of these things are possible. I think they did eventually find West Nile had something to do with an individual. Mosquito bit that individual, transmitted it, and on it went. This happens with other things besides West Nile, but this was one of the first instances that happened really at the very end of the 20th century. Now, West Nile eventually spread throughout the United States, and the peak cases or mortality for these cases was in 2006. All right, so that's that's part of again, this globalization of trade and travel resulted in a disease that had never been seen in the Western Hemisphere, being essentially just bottled up and transported on over. All right, so that's one way this is happening. Another way is sexually transmitted diseases. Before I go into this one, there's no judgment going on here. Remember, we're just taking a detached view. I don't want some of this wanders into the political, so I don't want to step into that mess. I just want to go through the just the facts of how this all pans out, or how it all plays out. Now, sexually transmitted diseases, according to many researchers, represents the greatest threat to worldwide health. 4 factors responsible for the dramatic increase in rates. We have 4 here. Our first one is the birth control pill, which reduced fears of unwanted pregnancy, which has also had the effect of reducing condom usage, which has which is actually effective in preventing STDs, whereas birth control pills aren't. Birth control pills are good at preventing babies, but again, that's not what we're talking about here. The second one is the ideology of sexual liberation and permissiveness among young urban adults throughout the world. The notion that you can have many sexual partners before one is married, or even while one is married. Again, no judging. These things have resulted in, more sexual partners, which is more opportunities for these diseases to be spread. We get to a new pattern of migrant employment in developing nations, which spreads STDs acquired in urban areas to the countryside. So people in the countryside go into the urban areas to work, then they go home. But while they were working, they may have been doing a little bit of playing, and that disease comes back home with them. And finally, the availability of multiple sexual partners. Again, because we're much more interconnected, these folks are you meet more people, more like-minded folks who are willing to have, interesting lunch periods, I guess. And this is really the most important risk factor in exposure to infection. More partners, more risk, more infection. Again, no judging, but that's how it's played out. All right, now a little bit less common, but certainly something that is on people's radar screens these days is bioterrorism. Now it's relatively new. It's a relatively new threat of infectious diseases, and it takes place when people knowingly prepare biological agents or gases and use them to deliberately induce illness and death among other people. Now this can happen either overtly or covertly. Overt meaning the perpetrator announces responsibility for the attack or is revealed by the attack, and covert, which is where it's unannounced. And the release of agents may be unrecognized until people start getting sick. We have some examples. 1995, there was a cult in Japan that released sarin gas. Was it the Rikyo cult in Tokyo? Sarin gas in the subways. It was a big deal. You guys probably, some of you guys were born yet? Maybe not. But I remember it being on the news. Big deal. People died. People got sick. 1996, we had an outbreak of gastroenteritis caused by a disgruntled coworker who put dysentery bacteria in pastries. I know, how gross is that? Was consumed by staff members at a large medical center lab. That's one way to get back at them. I'd recommend a strongly worded letter instead. It's less criminal. 2001, anthrax was sent through the U.S. mail. It was right after the September 11th attacks. Freaked everybody out. All right, so bioterrorism is not terribly common, but of course it's scary, and it's certainly on people's radar screens. All right, so let's move on. We'll go to bioethics. This is another area that medical sociologists concern themselves with, and it's an area of study focused on ethical decisions and practices with respect to medical care, research, and humans' rights over their bodies. Now, medical decisions can have profound social implications and may reflect discrimination and prejudice against particular social groups. Examples of this, there's quite a few, but certain groups, doctors don't take them as seriously when they report things like pain or chest pain or other physical complaints, and as a result their health outcomes are worse than, say, groups who are more believed by doctors. Now, there's lots of important cases of unethical behavior which spurred developmental regulations, or the development of regulations. Of course, we have the Nazi experiments. We're all familiar with those. If you're not, go ahead and read up on it, but make sure you do it during the day, not at night. It's really terrifying. We have the Tuskegee syphilis study in Alabama, 1932, where the government did not treat people who had syphilis. And there's an urban myth out there that the government actually gave people syphilis. That's not how it happened. Back in 1932 in Tuskegee, there were plenty of people with syphilis already. They didn't have to give it to anybody. But what they did is they took these folks and they told them they were being taken care of, but they didn't treat them just to see what happened to the course of the disease as people aged. So to see how long it took people to die. Now, the real ugly part of this is that study went on long after we already knew what happened to people who had untreated syphilis for decades. It was already a known thing, but that study carried on until the 70s, I believe. So, there's other examples too. There's the Milgram experiments where he tricked people into thinking they were shocking other people to death. There's the Stanford prison experiments where college students posing as guards abused college students who were inmates in a quote-unquote jail in the basement of the Stanford psychology building. All of these things, there's several more out there. But all of these different cases resulted in the development of something called an institutional review board. These are at every university that does research. And what they're responsible for is the oversight of this research. And the guiding principle is that people participating in these studies need to be fully informed, voluntary, It has to be fully informed voluntary patient consent. The study has to have acceptable risk-benefit ratios and has to guarantee patient anonymity and confidentiality. These guidelines are designed, again, to thwart some of these really ugly abuses that happened in previous research. And again, there's all kinds of terrible examples of it. So IRBs are our answer to it and have been largely effective. Not 100%, but largely. Other issues here, we have the HIPAA Act of 1996, which regulates the handling of patient data and privacy. This is why you can't just call and get your test results most of the time. You have to actually go in. That's why your doctor won't email you things. Why you can't just email your records to the doctor. They want them faxed or brought over personally. And again, this is to protect patient privacy. Bioethicists are also concerned with controversial areas of medical practice and research, such as funding of research by pharmaceutical companies, ghostwriting academic articles on the use of medical interventions. Ghostwriting is somebody else writes the paper where they put your name on it. Stem cell research, use of human genetic material, including cloning, abortion, euthanasia, reproductive technology. All of these things are things that bioethicists are studying, writing about, arguing about, and so on.